Thank you, Claire. Can you hear me? Yeah. Great. As Claire said, I'm Bernard Schwartz. I direct the Unterberg Poetry Center at the 92nd Street Y in New York. We've been around since 1939. I haven't been around since 1939. The recordings archive started in 1949 with a reading by E.E. Cummings. And since then, everyone under the sun. I'm curious, show of hands, has anyone come to one of these events in the past couple of years? Great. Second question, how many of you have heard the voices of Elizabeth Bishop and or Thom Gunn? How many of you have seen Elizabeth Bishop or Thom Gunn read in person? Okay. Now that the survey is over, thank you. The way that tonight will work is very simple and straightforward. Colm has selected Bishop and Gunn, specifically some excerpts from a Bishop reading in 1977 and a Thom Gunn reading in 1992. We'll hear the Bishop first, 3 poems, The Map, In the Waiting Room, and Santorim, from across her career. We've given out those poems so you can follow along. And then there are 2 Thom Gunn poems from 92 to close. As you probably well know, Colm has written somewhat thoroughly on both Elizabeth Bishop and Thom Gunn. And I think we'll start by him discussing why he's chosen to put the 2 of them together tonight.
Thanks, Bernard. It may not be obvious. Gunn was an English poet who lived in California for most of his life, and Bishop was an American poet, or at least was partly from Nova Scotia, and sort of moved downwards, going just from Nova Scotia to New York, to Florida, to Brazil, and back to Boston. So they're from different countries, and they're in a way they worked in different elements. But oddly enough, they coincided for a short period when Bishop lived in San Francisco. And she kept, if you follow the correspondence, I think she really deplored the beats and all the freedoms available in San Francisco at that time. She was against those sort of freedoms. She loved restrictions. And she was also desperately against gay liberation. She said, closets, and more closets, she said. And but you sort of notice in the correspondence, she keeps writing to people to say, the only poet I like here is Thom Gunn. And she says, for example, to Robert Lowell, August 68, well, I've met some of the poets, and the only one I still really like is Thom Gunn. October 68, she writes to Marianne Moore, one poet I've met here, almost a neighbour, I like very much, Thom Gunn. His poetry is usually very good, I think. He's English, but has lived here for a long time. And then the following year, in February, she did a reading with Gunn. And she thought that Gunn's poems and mine were the best. This is a letter she wrote to James Merrill. And then she wrote to another friend, same time, but I like Thom Gunn best, I think. It almost sounds like an alibi for something. Gunn remembered then, there's a sort of oral biography of Bishop where Gunn was interviewed, and he remembered, he remembered meeting Bishop in the spring of 1968, and he said, I answered the phone one day, and there was a very nice man I didn't know who asked me to come and have drinks with him and Elizabeth Bishop because she wanted to meet me. Elizabeth had just moved to San Francisco, so I went over, and there were Elizabeth and her female partner at the time, whose name was changed for just personal reasons. Elizabeth was drunk out of her mind. We made polite conversation all evening, while Elizabeth occasionally grunted out a monosyllable. The next day her partner phoned and wondered if I would like to try again. This time I was asked over to their place, and we got on wonderfully from then on. Elizabeth and I talked quite a lot during that year. It wasn't so we spoke much about our private lives. That's what makes a real friendship, a close friendship, meaning not to talk about your private life to somebody. She and I talked about poets we liked and specific poems that we liked and disliked. I never let Elizabeth know but I didn't particularly like her poetry myself at that time. When I first got to know her, I took another look at her poetry. I wasn't greatly struck by it. There seemed to be something, for lack of a better word, that I'll call deeper in her that hadn't got into the poetry. It wasn't until Geography 3, with poems like The Moose and these poems that we're going to look at, two of these poems, or three poems, that I saw that side of her. In a sense, with Geography 3, I can find more virtues in the earlier poetry than I could before. It reflects back on the early poetry. And then he reviewed Geography 3, and he talked about it sort of changing the whole way we look at her career. And what they had in common is interesting. I mean, why they didn't discuss their personal lives, why their friendship was formed about discussing things other than themselves, was that both of them had something they didn't want to talk about. And we noticed this in Gunn's book, Boss Cupid, where he writes a poem called The Gas Poker. And in that poem, it's a poem about the suicide of his mother when he was about 14, and he just says, could it have been 43 years ago? And it's the first mention of the suicide, the first open mention of the suicide in his work, 43 years after it occurs. And if you look at the poetry, you find that you wonder if Gunn's extraordinary control over stanza forms, over rhyme schemes, over metre, and indeed his attempt to loosen under the influence of various American poets, including Robert Duncan, loosen himself from these sort of this formal straitjacket that he had got first under the care of F.R. Leavis, and then under the care of Ivor Winters, and that he simply did not want, as he said in an interview, I don't want to be Sylvia Plath. In other words, that whatever he was suffering, he did not want it to come into the public domain. He wanted to keep it perhaps buried in the rhythm of his poems, or perhaps not there at all, just simply something that there was so much pain and difficulty with. That, I mean, what he did instead was, his name, I bought some of his books from a second-hand dealer in Berkeley, and he writes his name on early books he owned as William Thompson, because his name was Thompson. His name was, his name was, I'm going to get this wrong, his name was Gunn, his mother's name was Thompson. So he's William Thompson Gunn in those books, and he changes his name by deed poll eventually to Thom Gunn, so his mother's name Thompson would be in his name. And his brother Anders has a description of just how close he was to his mother. His parents had divorced, himself and his brother were being brought up by his mother, and they found his mother after she had gassed herself. The two boys did, and he was after that brought up by aunts until he went to Cambridge, and then soon after he went to Cambridge he made his home in California, and he on his death certificate it just says that he died from acute polysubstance abuse. In other words, that in his 70s he continued to take drugs that even those of us who are in our 60s have stopped taking. This reticence, this idea in a time when everyone, especially in the United States, was deeply affected by Robert Lowell's book Life Studies, in which you explored your own inner demons, and your own inner demons became the subject of your poetry. If you had a divorce, in the case of W.D. Snodgrass, Heart's Needle became your book about the divorce. If you had depression, as Anne Sexton, your book became about that difficulty. So too with Sylvia Plath. And in that period, which was called confessional poetry, Gunn stuck to his guns, as it were, and simply would not describe any trauma in his life, including, for example, it took him a long time to deal with his homosexuality. There's a sort of wonderful moment where the you, which he's used so beautifully up to then as a sort of disguise, as a doubling, as a sort of ambiguity, suddenly becomes he, him. And there's a moment in Jack Straw's Castle especially where you see it and you think, oh, this is a great moment, not only in poetry, but in the history of gay liberation. Bishop had no interest in gay liberation, as I said. She had her own demons. Her father died when she was 6 months old, and when she was about 4 or 5, her mother began to have serious nervous attacks. So she was put into a mental hospital, and she was never released from that hospital in Halifax. And so she was brought up as well by aunts. She was an orphan, she was an only child. She suffered from asthma. She became an alcoholic, and she she had a small trust fund, and so she moved to Brazil. But the poems once more exude a great reticence, a great way of needing to define the world as though no one has seen the world before. It must be controlled by her, the sentences and the rhythms of her poems. When she writes her famous poem, One Art, the poem, the Villanelle, that begins, "The art of losing isn't hard to master," it looks as though she's playing, sometimes mentioning small things like house keys that you can lose, and then big things like a continent or houses or rivers. But in the middle, what's missing is mentioning that she lost her mother, that she lost her father, and that she lost her lover, who committed suicide in New York when she was there. And oddly enough, you see that poem repeating the lines, "The art of losing isn't hard to master," and you come across in a letter where she just actually says it. "I lost my mother, I lost my father, I lost Lotham, who was her lover." That idea of loss for her was deeply personal. In the Villanelle, she makes it almost playful. She leaves out the things that mattered to her that she lost. And it isn't as though she didn't try. You can see scraps of poems that she didn't publish, she didn't finish, where she tries to deal with her mother, but she actually doesn't complete a poem about it. So that both of them, in a time when it was fashionable to write poems about trauma, about the self, about the dark spaces of the self, both of them kept away from that. So you can see them, I mean, that wonderful first meeting where she's so drunk she can't speak. And then when she gets to speak, what she doesn't say becomes more important, that they talk about the art of poetry. Anyone here who saw Thom Gunn reading will know what I'm talking about, which was that he really had no interest whatsoever in being famous. Perhaps he was more interested in being famous in certain bars in San Francisco than he was in the world of poetry. When I saw him first, I presumed there would be a huge crowd to see him in San Francisco. There was a huge crowd to see Armistead Maupin, and there was a huge crowd to see Isabel Allende. And in a side room, about 20 of us sat listening to Thom Gunn reading The Man with Night Sweats. And it was an astonishing, when I was talking to him afterwards, he thought that was just the best idea, just to have 20 and no more, so that he could slip off home as soon as possible. It was a Saturday. I think he had famous Saturday nights. I always wondered where he went, but he would never tell anyone in the literary world, because he thought the literary world was a strange thing that needed to be kept away from him. And he read, sometimes in a sort of monotone. He read as little as possible. I saw him reading a second time in San Francisco with a much younger, much less famous poet. Well, he gave the other poet all the time in the world, and he read 3 or 4 poems, and everyone had come to see him. So there was a sort of reticence, a distance from the world of poetry. And it wasn't just, it was the world of easy emotion. And it's a phrase we're going to find in this first poem by Elizabeth Bishop, where she talks about, I think, the thing that really made her and Gunn both afraid. Fraser, are you coming up? Oh, it was this, it's in the second stanza, it's the third last line of the map, where she talks about emotion too far exceeds its cause. I think that idea for both of them of sentimentality or of overreaction or of responding to an experience with too much rather than too little. So that they both were careful and restrained, and they used stanza form and systems of irony and systems of understatement so as not to be the person who exudes emotion, and emotion that too far exceeds its cause. So let's just listen to this first poem of the Elizabeth Bishop, The Map.
Land lies in water. It is shadowed green. Shadows, or are they shallows? At its edges, showing the line of long, seaweeded ledges where weeds hang to the simple blue from green. Or does the land lean down to lift the sea from under, drawing it unperturbed around itself? Along the fine, tan, sandy shelf is the land tugging at the sea from under. The shadow of Newfoundland lies flat and still. Labrador is yellow, where the moony Eskimo has oiled it. We can stroke these lovely bays under a glass as if they were expected to blossom, or as if to provide a clean cage for invisible fish. The names of seashore towns run out to sea. The names of cities cross the neighboring mountains. The printer here experiencing the same excitement as when emotion too far exceeds its cause. These peninsulas take the water between thumb and finger like women feeling for the smoothness of yard goods. Mapped waters are more quiet than the land is, lending the land their waves' own conformation. And Norway's hair runs south in agitation. Profiles investigate the sea where land is. Are they assigned, or can the countries pick their colors? What suits the character or the native waters best? Topography displays no favorites. North's as near as west. More delicate than the historians are the map makers' colors.
When is it? It's an early poem in the first book.
No, the reading.
Oh, 1977. Yeah. She wrote this poem, Colm surely knows this, claiming one single sitting in 1934 when she was 23, just contemplating a map under glass between Christmas Day and New Year's Eve, I think, and thought of it as the first sort of poem that was worth showing people. There's a new biography. Do you want to?
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say there's a new biography coming out of Bishop by a longtime Bishop scholar named Thomas Travisano, who put together a collection of the Bishop Lowell correspondence, which is absolutely wonderful. And he talks about a story that Bishop wrote of being in kindergarten in Canada and paying close attention. It was a school where the kindergartners were in with the older students, and the older students, the 4th and 5th graders, got geography, and she would pay attention to the geography lessons, even though they were for the older students. And the maps came down off a roll at the front of the classroom, and she loved the way they snapped down and snapped back up. And she describes in an early story of hers just longing to hold the map and touch the countries with her own hands, and imagining at that time that the whole rest of the world fit into Canada rather than the other way around. What were you going to say?
Could you talk a bit about the reading she did that she didn't want a recording of?
Sure. So part, I think, of what Colm was saying earlier on about the reticence of both Gunn and Bishop can be thought of as far as a skepticism where it comes to public performance. There's a remembrance that Gunn's partner, Mike Cathay, wrote after Gunn died. He says, Gunn didn't want to be Dylan Thomas. There's a moment that he's thinking along when Cathay and Gunn first met at Cambridge, and Gunn was giving his first poetry readings. And of course, the Y and Dylan Thomas have a famous or infamous history. And for Bishop, too, in this 1977 recording, most poets will read for a half hour, 40 minutes or so. She reads for about 22 minutes. The first sound you hear on the microphone when she comes up is a cough, and then an apology saying that she's got a cold. The Y was trying to get Bishop to read on its stage as early as 1947, 30 years prior. We know this because that first letter in Words in Air she writes to Robert Lowell is, I was supposed to be at the Y too on Saturday night. I hope my absence was more of a help than a hindrance. They hadn't met yet. They were soon to meet at Randall Jarrell's house. She then was pursued by the likes of me, running the Poetry Center, through the 50s and 60s, and there are letters. She had a close friend who ran the Poetry Center in the late 40s and early 50s named John Malcolm Brennan, and she writes a letter to him. She's on the schedule to read at the Y in the spring of 1950, and writes to him and says that she's sorry. Some people like doing it. She doesn't. She's read in the papers how he's attracting crowds of hundreds of people, and it's just not her thing. She writes from Brazil in the mid-1960s to another of my predecessors, talking about how it makes her miserable and she doesn't think that people like to see other people being made to feel miserable. When she finally gets to the Y, it's in 1973 with James Merrill, and she immediately writes to the Y. Merrill couldn't have been happier to read with Elizabeth Bishop at the Y. Now, he had first been at the Y in the mid-1940s because he was close with one of the earlier directors of the Poetry Center. This is a little inside baseball. But he said, no better dance partner could I have imagined than Elizabeth Bishop. Bishop, on the other hand, writes to the Poetry Center after the reading, complaining that on that evening she'd had some combination of bronchitis and dysentery, and that she must sound like a hypochondriac, but that she's been put off, and it's lingered, this experience of having had her photo taken and her voice recorded. The response that returns to Bishop now in Seattle, we have the letters in our archive from the secretary of the Poetry Center, says, I've seen to it myself that the recording has been burned and the negatives of the photographs have been destroyed. Some of the photos still exist, and there are backstage moments of almost, kind of lightness and joy. Someone had come in and given Bishop and Merrill laurels, crowns, and they are seen kind of just giggling with each other. But the recording in 73 was destroyed upon Bishop's request. We don't do that anymore. If somebody says, don't record me, we just kind of secretly do it and don't release it to the public. This is a nice moment to give a shout out to our website. For example, we're only hearing a portion of the Bishop reading from 1977 tonight. If you Google the Poetry Center and Elizabeth Bishop, you'll be able to hear the entire reading. So she makes an appearance in 1974, the following year, to read from her memoir of Marianne Moore, and it isn't until 1977 when she reads with Howard Moss, who was her longtime New Yorker editor. And that's the one that we're listening to today, and as I say, that reticence carries over into a kind of skepticism. The end of the reading has her saying, after, again, 20-some-odd minutes, I think that's enough, and leaving the stage. Howard Moss, in contrast, reads for 45 minutes or so. Everyone was there to see Bishop.
James Merrill said about her that she did a lifelong imitation of an ordinary woman. And that business of what she did, how she moved to Brazil, how she was just simply out of the loop, how she constantly, the letters are great, just no matter what event is occurring, she doesn't want to be at it. And if she has to even go to the United States for any purpose, it's always heavens. She uses heavens. I discovered it's in Nova Scotia. It's a Halifax. It's a thing you do in Nova Scotia. You say, heavens, I think it's going to rain tomorrow. Or heavens, I have to go to the London Review Bookshop. Heavens. And I was listening to the radio one morning in Nova Scotia, and I was so delighted. The woman kept saying, heavens, today or something. And she uses the word heavens in a poem. It's a poem called Poem, where she talks about a painting. And she says, suddenly in the poem says, heavens, I recognize the place, I know it. And this idea of heavens is always when she realizes that in the United States, the poetry world is being dominated by Robert Lowell, by Randall Jarrell, by John Berryman, and by James Merrill, by Howard Moss, by various other people, but being created as this great eccentric figure was her friend Marianne Moore. Not one of the boys, sort of strange, living with her mother in Brooklyn. Everyone knew all about the strangeness of Marianne Moore. And Elizabeth Bishop, either consciously or unconsciously, realized the only thing to do with this world was to get as far away from it as possible, was to become a mystery, was to live outside it, was to depend on Robert Lowell to get her prizes, if the prizes were going, or to get her whatever could be got in the poetry world without having to compete with the big boys. But she had a sense always, and she loved saying this in letters, that poems often took her 20 years, often took her more. Her poem, The Moose, for example, you can see a letter describing the experience of seeing the moose from a bus. And then you're talking 20 years later or more when she writes to her aunt to say, I'm dedicating the moose to you, you are not the moose. And then she reads the poem to a graduation ceremony, and then someone tells her, some great frenemy tells her afterwards, that a student had said to another student, "What was the poem like?" He said, "It was good as far as poems go." And she loved that. She thought it was the nicest thing anyone had said about her work for a long time, that it was as good as poems could go. She begins with an idea of an exquisite helplessness at the heart of her poetic self, that somehow the world is beyond her reach, beyond her control, that she's either too ill or too helpless, too broke, too lost to actually be in the world. So the world has to be described as though it will soon move, and not the things in it will not be there. So that this second line of the poem, The Map, is one of the things she does all the time in her work, and we'll see it later on in the other poems, where she makes a statement and then wonders if the statement is true. She corrects herself in poems. It's one of her modes. It might seem like a trick, except that you notice, for example, when Robert Lowell produces Imitations, his book of translations, she writes to him with the tiniest, I don't know if this is true, and you correct me if it's wrong, but I think the greatest pleasure you can have in life is correcting someone else's French. That there's nothing more enjoyable than saying means rather than and she really, really wrote a beautifully savage, gentle letter to Lowell, just pointing out how wrong his French was. Not just simply that he was taking risks with the translation. He was simply wrong, and she thought, why does it matter being wrong? And she's another letter about this. Well, she said it matters enormous if we don't pay attention to the small things in the world. There could be something enormous at stake if we do this. We mustn't do it. So that this poem, The Map, is one of the early poems of statement, where almost everything is taken as though nothing can be taken for granted, if you'll excuse that sentence. And but also the playfulness. Also, the fact that she's really interested in surrealism. She's really interested in what dreams can do. When she was at university, somebody noticed that she used to eat a quantity of cheese every night to see if her dreams could just be bigger and better and more strange. And this idea of taking an ordinary thing, she does it later on with her desk. She makes her desk into a poem. Every object is part of a battlefield, but as though seeing, and then from the seeing, beginning to sort of almost manage the world by finding a way of looking at it, which further estranges it. And every so often, she's really good. Similes are the hardest things to do because nothing is like anything. Wordsworth, the city just like a garment wear the beauty of the morning. Well, no, it doesn't. The city does not wear anything like a garment. But when Bishop has that a duck or some is moving through a pond and it's making a scissors shape in the water, like a scissors opening. But this one that she does here, when she talks about peninsulas take the water between thumb and finger, like women feeling for the smoothness of yard goods. And just that idea of a startling image, which she loved, of course, because she loved George Herbert. One of the things Thom Gunn loved talking about was George Herbert. And she loved those sort of ways of re-seeing the entire world, where you're talking about a peninsula, jutting out like that, but actually thumb and finger. And she thinks, for a minute, you can see her thinking, what's thumb and finger? How her mind works? Oh, she thinks back to almost to Nova Scotia childhood, women feeling for the smoothness of yard goods. So the poem is essentially playful. But it's also, at its heart, some idea that nothing can be taken for granted, that even land, even water, even the names for things must each one be written down as I said, in a poetry of statement. Something is land lies in water, it is shadowed green. That idea of stating, controlling, seeming to fix things because they might unfix if you didn't fix them. So that the entire syntax here is a syntax that is involved in a form of, let's say, re-seeing the world in order to further control it, or in order further that it might not unloose itself from one's grasp, and that is part of the sort of game of the poem. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it doesn't sum it up, but it says enough for now. Thinking along the lines and segueing into In the Waiting Room of her, fanaticism around things like accuracy in the correspondence with Howard Moss at the New Yorker, who ends up publishing this next one, In the Waiting Room. She preempts the fact checkers, who possibly were the only people more fanatical than she would have been about what was right or erroneous in the poem. They fact check poems. I guess they still probably do, but she preempts it by saying, you'll notice in The Waiting Room, she calls out National Geographic, and she goes back and checks that the issue she has in mind is the issue that she writes down, but then admits to Moss in the letter that she has conflated a couple of them in the poem, as if she's confessing. Should we hear?
Just one more thing. I wanted to say something about fact checking. I once said that in a piece for the New Yorker that Conor Cruiser Brown was the kiss of death, and the fact checker called him up at home and said, "Are you the kiss of death? Just checking." And then they called me back saying he's denied this. And another time I said that Seamus Heaney was a Catholic, just Seamus Heaney, a Catholic, and the fact checker faxed him. And he said out of his fax machine quite late at night, about 11 or 12 at night, a new fax came, and it was a fact checker to say, "Are you a Catholic?" And so anyway, that's just fact checking. But just about this poem, just notice in this poem how the word inside is used. And on your second page, just notice when she says, "Suddenly from inside came an O of pain." I think the best book written on Elizabeth Bishop, saving my own presence, is David Calstone's book called Becoming a Poet, which is about Robert Lowell, Marianne Moore, and Bishop. And Calstone was in communication with Bishop, and he said that inside, the word inside here, should be read ambiguously. Should be read as suddenly from inside, meaning from inside the little girl's head, as much as from inside the other room. Bishop was incandescent with rage. I think she must have been drunk. And she called him up long distance to say, inside means inside, as opposed to outside. The girl is outside in the waiting room. Her aunt is inside in the dentist's surgery. That is what inside means. It does not mean anything else. And if you go on thinking it does, I will change the word. Because I want words to mean what they say. I'm not having this. So just as an interesting letter to David Costa. So let's hear this poem.
This recording is about 4 minutes long.
In Worcester, Massachusetts, I went with Aunt Consuelo to keep her dentist appointment and sat and waited for her in the dentist's waiting room. It was winter, got dark early. The waiting room was full of grown-up people, Arctics and overcoats, lamps and magazines. My aunt was inside what seemed like a long time. And while I waited, I read the National Geographic. I could read, and carefully studied the photographs. The inside of a volcano, black and full of ashes. Then it was spilling over in rivulets of fire. Osa and Martin Johnson dressed in riding breeches, laced boots, and pith helmets. A dead man slung on a pole. Long pig, the caption said. Babies with pointed heads wound round and round with string. Black, naked women with necks wound round and round with wire like the necks of light bulbs. Their breasts were horrifying. I read it right straight through. I was too shy to stop. And then I looked at the cover, the yellow margins, the date. Suddenly, from inside came an O of pain. Aunt Consuelo's voice. Not very loud or long. I wasn't at all surprised. Even then, I knew she was a foolish, timid woman. I might have been embarrassed, but wasn't. What took me completely by surprise was that it was me, my voice in my mouth. Without thinking at all, I was my foolish aunt. We were falling, our eyes glued to the cover of the National Geographic, February 1918. I said to myself, 3 days and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round, turning world into cold, blue-black space. But I felt, you're an I, you're an Elizabeth, you're one of them. Why should you be one too? I scarcely dared to look to see what it was I was. I gave a sidelong glance. I couldn't look any higher. Shadowy gray knees, trousers and skirts and boots and different pairs of hands lying under the lamps. I knew that nothing stranger had ever happened. Nothing stranger could ever happen. Why should I be my aunt, or me, or anyone? What similarities? Boots, hands, the family voice I felt in my throat, or even the National Geographic, and those awful hanging breasts held us all together, or made us all just one. How, I didn't know any word for it, how unlikely. How had I come to be here like them, and overhear a cry of pain that could have got loud and worse, but hadn't? The waiting room was bright and too hot. It was sliding beneath a big black wave, another and another. Then I was back in it. The war was on. Outside in Worcester, Massachusetts, were night and slush and cold, and it was still the 5th of February, 1918.
The thing with Robert Lowell, I mean, the first things we learn about Bishop that are, I mean, as I said, there was so little in the poems about the self. But in the book, in his book History and the previous book Notebook, which History was a version of, Robert Lowell has a number of sonnets for Elizabeth Bishop. One, he talks about, he uses the phrase words in air, that she would hang her poems, like, as though on a line, and keep them there for years. And he said he called her someone who makes the casual perfect. He also has a sonnet where he's using a letter from Bishop, where she's talking about being at the end of her tether emotionally, and saying to him, your letter helped like being mailed a lantern or a spiked stick. Bishop, of course, was very uneasy about her letters being used by Lowell as poems. But we get some sense for the first time, this is in the early 70s, of that there was a great deal behind these poems of Bishop's that seem so casual, and that it's so easy to read this poem as just being about a girl in a waiting room with her aunt inside. You have to remember that I think Bishop is one of those people where the more you learn about her, the more the poems seem deeper and stranger. That no one knew what to do with this strange little girl once her mother was put away and her father died. The Bishops were very rich. They were big builders. They had built a lot of the main public buildings in New England. And she had a trust fund, but no one knew where she should be. When they came to Great Village, just in Nova Scotia, they found her in bare feet wandering around with chickens and stuff. And the Bishops wanted her to get a proper education. But when they moved her from her mother's family to their family, she became really ill and seriously unhappy. And then they moved her to an aunt where she was sort of better, but there was always this longing to go back to Great Village in Nova Scotia and back somehow to a past that was, of course, irrecoverable. So that this poem, which begins, and if you notice her reading where she refuses to read a line as iambic. I mean, she refuses to go, you could go to keep her debt. She just doesn't do, when she has to keep, she won't stress the keep of it. She'll go, her reading system is as though this is prose, as though this is casual, as though this was written over an otherwise busy weekend. That she just remembered that, I went with my Aunt Consuelo and sat and waited for her And this is why it's so important that the word inside means inside, because it's just what happened, written down as a matter of fact. And it's this, and she does it also in her poem At the Fish Houses, just describing something, making something ordinary seem even more ordinary than it might have been. Just getting the language of poetry and bringing it down to a level whereby there's no rhetoric involved, there's no poetry involved, there's no beat in the line. There's just a set of statements which are about ordinary experience. And what she's doing is she's actually holding her breath, as it were. She's actually building up a set of expectations that nothing of any significance can happen in this poem other than the little girl will read the magazine and the ant perhaps will come back out. And it's always fascinating to watch where exactly she does the change. I mean, this is on the second page where she goes, when she says, I might have been embarrassed but wasn't. I mean that is probably the least, if you compare this to the American poems being written in the same year, you find that almost no one is willing to be in possession of this sort of ease with a line, this sort of ease with a conversational tone. And what took me completely by surprise was that it was me. What me? My voice in my mouth, without thinking at all. And the crucial word becomes the word I, where actually that whole idea of who she is becomes almost incantatory as she moves with the word I. The word I, instead of being the single consciousness who merely remembers a single event that was not of much importance, the I becomes surrounded with mystery, with question, with wonder. So I was my foolish aunt. And then the word I has to be corrected here. We were falling, our eyes glued to the cover. And she's always moving back as though for full protection to fact. The date, February 1918. This business of where she mentions the war was on, which is in the last stanza. In November 1917, the largest explosion that had ever taken place in the world took place in Halifax Harbour, where a munition ship was crashed into by another ship and blew up, and large numbers of people were killed. But her mother was in the actual mental hospital there, and the windows were blown in. So you can just imagine this 6-year-old and the war, that it wasn't nothing that the war was on. But what's fascinating is the fact that what she's doing with tone, how she's using tone almost to manipulate the reader into a state of ease, and then using the same tone to unsettle the reader totally, to get the word, in a way, one of the crucial words in poetry in these years, the word I, and get the word and turn it and see where it will take you, correct it, undermine it. So the whole idea of personal identity will, in this very real place named, in this very real time named, with all the details described, the very thing at the center, the I, the person, the idea of personhood, selfhood, is to be undermined, questioned, and made dramatic.
I think also it may be worth pointing out that kind of characteristic downplaying is there in the lines. How had I come to be here like them and overhear a cry of pain that could have got loud and worse, but hadn't? That's a kind of bookend to I might have been embarrassed but wasn't. Sort of turning the temperature down on the stove before it gets too hot. The next poem is Bishop had an enormous interest in geography. And it was almost sometimes that she was desperately interested in geography as a way of keeping history at bay. And of course, the idea of traveling in Brazil for her and keeping diaries and writing letters. So her letters from her journeys are absolutely marvelously, filled with deep description. I think this time in Santarém we've got to watch how the extraordinary precision of the detail adds up to something much more than mere travelogue. But it does so subtly, strangely, in a way that's not obvious.
I mean, in a way you don't say, oh, this is where she starts to make a poem from casual travel experience. That it's almost imperceptible at times. There's something happening in the rhythm here, which I think is the sort of thing that Thom Gunn began to notice in her work, that underneath what was casual was something that was much more deliberate, but still hidden, and was to do with actual rhythm, the sound of words, the gaps, where the commas come, how the lines end, and that whole idea of the power, what's buried in understatement, how much you can do with a short sentence. And it's not, I think it's not nothing that she was in Florida and knew some of the people Hemingway knew and was aware of what Hemingway was doing in prose, of paring things down to very little to see how much emotion you could get if you didn't name the emotion, but get the emotion from the rhythm that's buried in prose as much as in poetry as much as in prose. So will we listen to this?
Yeah, one brief comment. I think one of the themes of these series is always what is similar and what is different about reading a collection of poetry and maybe attending a live reading. And this is true of both the Gunn and the Bishop recordings that we're hearing. If you were able to hear them in full, you'd be able to, I think, appreciate the poet's choices as maybe skeptical as each of them would have been about saying yes to an invitation and showing up before a crowd of people. The reading that Bishop gives starts with the map, it ends with Santorini, and there's a poem in between. So there's her kind of moving from kind of theoretical travel through the looking and contemplating of the maps reanimated, and then this kind of actual travel log. But similarly, among the 6 poems that she reads, one is, and speaking of Florida and Hemingway and the Cubans living down in Key West, there's Hieronymo's house. And one of the images in that poem is kind of, the I in Hieronymo's house is not Elizabeth Bishop, it's Hieronymo. And she goes through the house and describes his prized possessions, and they're not many of them, but one of them is a wasp's nest. And when the hurricanes come, it's one of the things that he takes with him to higher ground. And a wasp's nest shows up in this poem as well. Something to watch out for. Okay.
Of course, I may be remembering it all wrong after how many years. That golden evening, I really wanted to go no farther. More than anything else, I wanted to stay a while in that conflux of 2 great rivers, Tapajos and Amazon, grandly, silently flowing east. Suddenly there'd been houses, people, and lots of mongrel river boats skittering back and forth under a sky of gorgeous underlit clouds, with everything gilded, burnished along one side, and everything bright, cheerful, casual, or so it looked. I liked the place. I liked the idea of the place. 2 rivers. Hadn't 2 rivers sprung from the Garden of Eden? No, that was 4, and they diverged. Here only 2, and coming together. Even if one were tempted to literary interpretation, such as life, death, right, wrong, male, female, such notions would have dissolved straight off in that watery, dazzling dialectic. In front of the church, the cathedral rather, there was a modest promenade and a belvedere about to fall in the river. Stubby palms, flamboyant like pans of embers, buildings 1 story high, stucco, blue or yellow, one house faced with azulejos, buttercup yellow. The street was deep in dark gold river sand, damp from the ritual afternoon rain. And teams of zebus plodded, gentle, proud, and blue, with down-curved horns and hanging ears, pulling carts with solid wheels. The zebus' hoofs, the people's feet, waded in golden sand, dampered by golden sand. So almost the only sounds were creaks and shush, shush, shush. 2 rivers full of crazy shipping, people all apparently changing their minds, embarking, disembarking, rowing clumsy dories. After the Civil War, some Southern families came here. Here they could still own slaves. They left occasional blue eyes, English names, and oars. No other place, no one, on all the Amazon's 4,000 miles does anything but paddle. A dozen or so young nuns, white-habited, waved gaily from an old stern wheeler getting up steam, already hung with hammocks. Off to their mission, days and days away up God knows what lost tributary. Side-wheelers, countless wobbling dugouts. A cow stood up in one, quite calm, chewing her cud while being ferried, tipping, wobbling, somewhere to be married. A river schooner with raped masts and violet-colored sails tacked in so close her bowsprit seemed to touch the church. The cathedral, rather. A week or so before, there'd been a thunderstorm, and the cathedral had been struck by lightning. One tower had a widening zigzag crack all the way down. It was a miracle. The priest's house right next door had been struck too, and his brass bed, the only one in town, galvanized black. Gracias a Dios, he had been in Belém. In the blue pharmacy, the pharmacist had hung an empty wasp's nest from a shelf. Small, exquisite, clean matte white and hard as stucco. I admired it so much he gave it to me. Then my ship's whistle blew. I couldn't stay. Back on board, a fellow passenger, Mr. Swan, Dutch, the retiring head of Phillips Electric, really a very nice old man, who wanted to see the Amazon before he died, asked, "What's that ugly thing?" I think that's enough.
I think that's enough. I think that what we notice here is the anti-heroic nature of the voice, that she's interested in small things. And it's almost as though she's writing a poem within the poem, a poem to say, you know, I will not make large statements about life, but don't think I can't. If I really wanted to, you know, I could use the word dialectic in a poem, which is more than you could do. And I could make it work in a poem, but other than that, I have no interest in making philosophical statements. I want to notice things, and I want to find a rhythm whereby if I notice enough and I find the rhythm enough, I will actually manage to create a level of feeling around noticing that will be almost exquisite, that will have a sense in it of sort of density and purity. But you will never know where that came from, what moment that began. And also, I know how to end a poem, which is on a dying fall, which is to find almost nothing at the end to say. And I will not make this wasp's nest into a symbol. I will do anything to stop that. It's a wasp's nest. But nonetheless, despite the fact my efforts not to make it into something that you can say it really is standing for something else, it is something that she wants to bring with her. It does have a mysterious presence in the poem as object. We cannot be sure what it means or even what it does here. But nonetheless, the fact that everything else has been in a state of flux and that this somehow has hardened, that nature has hardened it into becoming an artifact, it seems, as much as a thing in nature, and that has to mean something. But she has no intention of saying what. And again, this joke about the cathedral, you know, that it's not a church, it's a cathedral, you know, it's repeated twice, as though her correcting herself is actually, you know, is a fundamental part of her system. That in other words, in the same way as River's crazy shipping, people all apparently changing their minds. there's always a sense in her poems that the poems came as a result of her changing her mind, that noticing something and feeling she hadn't noticed it enough, and coming back to it to see there's one more colour or one more detail that can be described.
Yeah, I think it's worth underlining that you hear the audience's laughter. Bishop is funny in this poem with the parentheticals and the self-correcting and the through line of cathedral and church, but also the cow getting married and the priest having the only brass bed in town. I don't know if I had been in the audience that night that I would have laughed out loud, but there it is on the recording. I don't mean that I wouldn't have laughed out loud because it's not funny, but rather because it sort of takes you by surprise. You're not expecting.
There's a feeling that she must have smiled, that she must have done something.
Yeah.
Because you can hear a little laugh under her voice.
And you wish for the video in that respect too, because you inch closer by having her there, her voice uttering.
She would have made you wipe that video. You know,
Yeah.
It would have been so sad because you would have had it and then not.
That's true.
You know,
there's not a lot of time. Should we move quickly to the Thom Gunn?
Yeah, I just want to say that how are we doing?
We'll get it in.
Oh, we're doing badly.
No, we started late. So
you
we're
started
fine.
late.
Yeah.
Just that it really is impossible to say Thom Gunn was one type of poet and not another. And that he may end up being the poet for us of states of dreaming, of waking from sleep, of being of that first hour of consciousness. He may be a poet about gay experience. He may be a 16th century poet in the 20th century. He may be the great elegist, the greatest elegist of his time. He may be, those poems in The Man with Night Sweats may be poems with the best read in conjunction with some poems in the 16th century, some poems by Thomas Hardy. This first one, anyway, is when, people felt, there were people in this very barrio who felt that he had gone to hell in San Francisco, that he had loosened his rhythms, that he had stopped being precise, that he had stopped being this great poet of his first books, Fighting Terms, and that he had really given up the game, and he himself really hated this view of his own work. He felt that he had found something golden in the Golden State for his poetry, but then he produced, in the time of AIDS, he produced The Man with Night Sweats, where he went back to using using stanza form, using strict meters, and using rhyme. And he was probably the only poet in California in that time to know what a rhyme even was. I mean, we're talking about the time of Gary Snyder and of Allen Ginsberg. So let's just listen to one of these elegies.
One quick note, sorry to jump in, is this is another instance where it pays to know what has come before in the reading that Gunn has set up, like a musician who arrives at a set list. Some of these recordings you listen to and the poet will be bumbling and trying to figure out what it is he or she should read next. In this instance, it's very deliberate. So this is a poem that is about a friend of his called Charlie Hinckley, who dies of AIDS. There's an earlier poem in the reading which is it's called Differences, and it's about meeting Charlie Hinckley for the first time. And one of the lines is, I think, worth having in your head when you listen to this recording. It's conscience and courage stood fleshed out in you.
Memory unsettled. Your pain still hangs in air, sharp motes of it suspended. The voice of your despair, that also is not ended. When near your death a friend asked you what he could do, remember me, you said. We will remember you. Once, when you went to see another with a fever in a like hospital bed, with terrible hothouse cough and terrible hothouse shiver that soaked him and then dried him, and you perceived that he had to be comforted, you climbed in there beside him and hugged him plain in view, though you were sick enough and had your own fears too.
What he did here is that he found that the relaxed rhythms he'd been using in his free verse suddenly could be used again. and he could relax them and tighten them. In other words, he could use the meters he had been using as a young poet, bring them back, but as instead of as a formal made poem, he could make it sound like a voice speaking. He could give it a natural sound that I think came from the work he had done in between being a formalist and being a much more relaxed poet. August Kleinzahler, who was a close friend of his and did the first selected poems, said, "No, stop, you're all wrong about him. He was a great poet of the city. He wrote street poems. These are the poems we should be attending to. You know, the elegies are fine, the early formal poems, but the street poems, notice the street poems." And this poem is called "Do Not All Things Well." And I don't want to read the whole poem because we're missing out of time, but that line is from a poem called "Now Winter Nights Enlarged" by Thomas Campion. It's a 16th century poem, and I think it has the greatest last line. If it's just so uplifting, and so if you're depressed, and also, anyway, just listen to the second stanza of this poem by Thomas Campion. It's a poem about love. "This time doth well dispense with lovers' long discourse. Much speech hath some defence, though beauty no remorse. All do not all things well, some measures comely tread, some knotted riddles tell, some poems smoothly read. The summer hath his joys, and winter his delights, though love and all his pleasures are but toys, they shorten tedious nights." And so that this poem is one of the poems that it's showing Gunn relaxed in San Francisco, just watching the street, just enjoying his life. And sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, and having earlier read a poem called "In Time of Plague," which is about two junkies named John and Brad who are trying to tempt him to, I guess, shoot up heroin with their needle on a park bench, which he declines to do. There are John and Brad, the true junkies in Time of Plague, and in this poem we have the auto junkies who are his next door neighbors.
Here's a poem called "All Do Not All Things Well." The title is a quotation from a poem of Campion's, turn of the 16th century, "Now Winter Nights Enlarge the Number of Our Hours." It's about the winter occupations of the great house in Elizabethan times. He says, "All do not all things well. Some measures comely tread, some knotted riddles tell, some poems smoothly read," and goes on through the occupations that they were doing. Well, this is about Cole Street in San Francisco and about two of my neighbors in the early 1970s who liked to mend cars. I didn't write about it till about 15 years later. The title is also the first line. "All do not all things well" implies that some, therefore, do well for its own sake one thing they undertake because it has enthralled them. I used to like the two auto freaks, as I called them, who labored in their driveway, its concrete black with oil, in the next block that year. One, hurt in jungle war, had a false leg. The other raised a huge beard above a huge Hell's Angel belly. They seemed to live on beer and corn chips from the deli. Always with friends, they sprawled beneath a ruined car in that inert but live way of scrutinizing innards. And one week they extracted an engine to examine, transplant shining like tar, fished out into the sun. "It's all that I enjoy," said the stiff-legged boy. That was when the officious realtor had threatened them for brashly operating a business on the street. An outsider, that woman, who wanted them evicted, wanted the neighborhood neat to sell it. That was when the boy from Vietnam told me that he'd firebomb her car. He didn't, of course. She won. I'm sorry that they went. Quick with a friendly greeting, they were gentle, jokey men, certainly not ambitious, perhaps not intelligent unless about a car. Their work, one thing they knew they could for certain do, with a disinterest and passionate expertise to which they gave their best desires and energies. Such oily-handed zest bypassed the self, like love. I thought that they were good for any neighborhood.
One question for Colm before we open it up to the floor, which is, are you really the first one who's taken Bishop and Gunn and begun to look at them side by side? I hadn't found anything else that did that.
Well, in the oral autobiography, they do interview Gunn, about her.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think anyone else had noticed that I think the time they spent together was significant, because I think their poetics had a great deal in common, and the fact that I think they both were interested in figures like George Herbert or in figures like Campion, what they were reading in poetry, and the fact that they felt like outsiders in their world. I mean, there was no one in California writing as Gunn was writing, and when he then wrote his free verse poems, there was no one in England writing like he was writing. So he was always on his own as a poet. He didn't come in a school. Yeah. Even though he was associated with Ted Hughes, he had really very little in common with Hughes. And Bishop was the same. And in other words, you even see with this last poem, so much is casual, so much is just something ordinary, just being written down and said. And then he can get away with such oily-handed zest, which is, just something bypass the self like love. And you're back with the Campion and with the whole idea of trying to say something mysterious, but putting it in a context which is so ordinary that it seems to actually repel mystery, and that mystery can enter all the more powerfully for that.
You say in Love in a Dark Time that these were writers who meant a great deal to you as a teenager, chiefly for the secret of their homosexuality and how they concealed it or how it manifested itself in the work in other ways. I'm interested, because you're no longer a teenager, in how
I am at heart. Give me a break.
Your relationship to these poets and their work has deepened. You said earlier that the more you know about Elizabeth Bishop's life, the more you see what's lurking between the lines. And would you just say something about living with these writers' work across the years?
That I certainly didn't know that Bishop was gay when her selected poems were published by Chatto & Windus. And when Geography 3 came out, I still didn't know. I didn't know Gunn was gay, even though it was staring me in the face. And I had a friend who was doing a thesis on him who didn't know he was gay. So that it was something in the poetry. And at first, in Love in a Dark Time, I thought, well, that must be that sort of gayness. There must be a thing called gayness. It must be in poetry. And you read a poem, and even though you don't know the poet's gay, something about the lines or the phrases or the way the commas, it's a gay way of writing commas, or there's a thing called the gay semicolon. And I really had to rethink this in the light of reading about both of them. Was, of course, that they both lost parents in childhood. And that may be what I was finding in the work, in the phrasing, in a sort of melancholy, in a tug of emotion that was in the poems, but not actually mentioned in the poems, was in the rhythm of the poems. And I may have misunderstood when I read them first, thinking it was when I found out they were gay, thought that was why I was interested, that it may have been actually something else.
Should we take a few questions? Just a few. There's a microphone that, right, Claire's going to bring around, and because it's being both video and audio recorded, it's not called video anymore.
But we'll destroy it later, yes, so we'll write a long letter complaining about something.
Please wait for the mic.
Hi, hello.
Thank you for sharing all that amazing knowledge. I mean, it's very generous indeed. Do you think that it's always better to hear a poet read their own poetry, or is it just a separate thing? Can you get readers of poems who do it better than the poet? Does that make sense?
I mean, this is about reading poetry. It really made such a huge difference to so many people in Ireland, and I presume here also, when they saw Seamus Heaney reading, and the way he introduced the poem, and his own accent in the poem. So that would be one real example of hearing somebody and it making an enormous difference to the poems. The problem with actors is that they act. And you can hear Bishop and Gunn just deciding, I'm not acting, I'm not doing that for you. You know, this poem is filled with emotion, but I'm burying it for you. And that in itself is an interesting idea, the sort of bad reading by the poet of the poet's own poems. So it's, you know, it's an interesting one because I think everyone lives in fear of becoming Dylan Thomas. You know, of going on a circuit filled with alcohol, drinking yourself to death with huge audiences every night as you once more intone, do not go gentle into that good night. You know, and but it's also marvellous to hear Philip Larkin reading and the sort of extraordinary tone he takes. And, yeah, but she isn't trying to make you emote. She isn't emoting on the stage of the Y. She's unemoting, if there's such a word allowed.
Yeah, and to just one of the real privileges of my job is going into the audio archive, and often it's the case that we have the poets for decades and decades, and then there'll be some kind of tribute after they've passed or on some big anniversary, and that will be some combination of poets who are paying tribute, and then actors, right? So there's this data set of any number of actors taking the work that you've already heard the poet do across decades. I think there are all sorts of interesting academic answers. What's going on with self-performance? Just in the examples that we've had in this series, you know, Ted Hughes came as close to being Dylan Thomas and succeeding, maybe, I think, at least to my ears.
Yeah, he did, yeah.
And then we featured Eliot in this, and it's compelling, it's dramatic, and it's worth having, you know, braved the rain in December 1950 to go on and heard somebody like Eliot read, although he says, I don't know why you would have done this. You know, he comes out on stage and immediately is undermining the experience for the audience. But the performance, he doesn't sabotage the poems. But I would say even today, you hear people read and you think, oh, the work on the page deserved a lot better, whatever better is to your ears. Or in the other direction, somebody's performance will, quote unquote, sell the poem. And I think that same idea is true if you've been to any number of readings, but also because a reading is set in a very specific time and place. You know, somebody could have had a late night or had a frazzled commute. And I think that's some of the moment in timeness of these recordings that is lost. We treat them with a certain reverence because they were carefully preserved, and it's many years after the fact. And in a lot of instances, it's a given that these are authors who've already ascended. There are a lot of, for example, in any given year that these recordings would have been plucked out of, there would have been a reading series with 30, 40, sometimes more events. And if you just look at the season brochures and across 80 some odd years, you know, who made it and who didn't make it? Who are we continuing to service? Or who, to our surprise, sort of comes around again? Before reading Colm's book, which is on Elizabeth Bishop, I had never read Thom Gunn and was very happy to discover that we had multiple recordings of Thom Gunn in the archive, and then to have the opportunity further to come talk about him, which entailed me, you know, thinking seriously about his work and learning about his life. That's a long answer, which I'll cut off.
You talked very interestingly about Elizabeth Bishop's life and Thom Gunn's life. Do you think knowing about the background of a poet or the life they've lived adds anything to the poetry?
I think
to your understanding of the poetry.
I mean, oddly enough, I think even more for a poet than a prose writer, biography can really enrich a poem. I think it's certainly true in the case of Yeats, for example, with Roy Foster's real biography. But with Bishop, just simply knowing the amount of loss, and the amount of loss in the life, and the amount of loss not mentioned in the poems, and you realise the poems are almost bulwarks or anchors or ways of keeping the other thing at bay. And then you watch as feeling comes in, but comes in a strange way. So yes, I think it really matters that we know about the life. The problem, I mean, for me, the problem is that I read Sylvia Plath before I knew much about her. And I read Elizabeth Bishop the same, so I had the good experience of finding out later. I think the problem becomes if you suddenly think the only thing interesting about Sylvia Plath is her suicide and is her relationship to Ted Hughes. I think then you think, well, you miss the actual poetry. So it's a difficult one because sometimes you need not to know anything. And there are poets we don't know much about.
Go ahead, please.
That Thomas Campion poem, for example, we don't need to know who he was in love with or why he was in love or what was going on that made him have tedious nights. We just don't need to know. It's just one of those lyric moments that belongs to us all, but a biography won't help us read. And so that's an example of one where it doesn't matter.
And to just give one example about Bishop, it's sort of where you put the weight, and it's interesting to see when new biographies come out where the weight is placed. There's an anecdote in the one that's coming out this fall. She wanted to be a professional musician. She studied in grade school and high school, and she gets to Vassar, and one of the earliest part of being a serious music student at Vassar, where that's true anywhere, is that you had to regularly perform in public. And one of the first times, if not the first time that she had to do it, I think it was the first time, she freezes. And these were pieces that she'd been practicing and knew how to play. And it is not a minor crisis in her life at that moment. And word gets back to her music teacher, who had been instructing her for years prior to that moment. But you think about something as local as her skepticism in terms of performance, or how much she discloses of herself on the page, or just what her persona is, and how much do you weigh a moment like that, where she thought one of, if not the central future for her was to be, I mean, the idea of Elizabeth Bishop as a concert pianist is almost unfathomable, but there in the record is the fact of the case. And was she diverted utterly? Was this the moment where things went a different way? There's a similar instance later where she moves to New York and enrolls in medical school at Cornell, and Marianne Moore apparently talks her out of it. So how much do you weigh? So which do you want, the Elizabeth Bishop, the concert pianist, or the Elizabeth Bishop, neurosurgeon or something? So I think it's how you weigh it, and you sort of you think about what your sources are and from which you're gathering this information.
Well, I was just going to say that, in a sense, all Bishop's poems are autobiographical in that they're all true. She wasn't interested in writing poems that weren't true, and all the details that she writes about she has seen and makes you see them. But because she was a very reserved person and didn't like confessional poems at all, she said, I just wish they wouldn't say those things about confessional stuff. It wasn't until she wrote her last poem, Sonnet, which actually she says who she is, and the New Yorker wouldn't take it, even though it is a very subtle little poem, Sonnet, isn't it?
Yeah, sonnet is one of the, it's a skinny little sonnet, and there are hardly any words in it at all. And you feel it's almost it's a letter to Robert Lowell, who'd been writing thousands of sonnets and revising them, and he was sonnet-led, he was sonnet-crazy, and often with her, she's often sending a message to Lowell, calm down, honey, just calm down, honey, it's fine, just keep it down. And with her little sonnet, you feel it's a message to Lowell saying, this is a sonnet, I just wrote one. And she loved that idea of, I take 20 years, you write in a frenzy, I am the real artist. And of course, she's the one, you're talking about that, who makes it, who doesn't. I thought it was funny, she did say to someone about, I love the phrase, I always think it would make a great Villanelle, there isn't anyone I couldn't make. There's no woman I couldn't make, meaning, and I love the idea that somehow or other, that behind all this reticence, that she was a tremendous drunk and would call people late at night making crazy phone calls, and poems just didn't do that. I love that distance between the poem and the self.
Well, they both abuse substance, and one of the things that you could, talk about, although we haven't, is, were they composing work? Did they ever compose work under the influence? The characteristics of this work would lead us to think that was not the case. I don't know enough to say.
Gunn has something very interesting to say about that. He's saying that the controlling imagination, which he certainly had one, often comes from vast chaos. And that he would think he was talking about Christopher Marlowe, and he was talking about figures who seem to have had led hugely untidy lives. You often find that somehow or other, as that gets distilled onto the page, it gets distilled with a great exercise of fierce control, which is, I think, what both of them did. And it's a very interesting dichotomy, between the actual surface self, which is untidy, and I hesitate to say inner self, but the self as artist, which wants to make actual, very, very reticent, tidy, perfect, as it were, poems.
What's in there? Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much.